Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Chris Province.
And I am Luke Freeman, and we are excited to be back this month with another episode with our series on leading a team. So if you'll remember, last season was all about leading yourself and principles of self-management and how do you move forward as an individual leader. This season is all about, okay, you have influence over other people. What are those skills? What are those things that you need to be learning and understanding and experimenting with day in and day out to continue to move your team forward as effectively as possible? And I know for us, our slant is always, how do we be transformational leaders? How do we, yes, understand how to have transactions that move an organization forward? We have to know the X's and O's of the plays that we're playing. And how is the experience that we're providing transformative and fulfilling in the lives of our team members and in the character and life of our organization? So we have talked about this season, this weird change between when you're just responsible for leading yourself and then all of a sudden you're plopped in and now you're leading other people and your deliverables change and the definition of success changes. And it's just like a completely different game that many of us aren't prepared for. We talked about the importance of trust. We talked about how we build accountability and shared commitments on a team. And we've talked about some principles of effective communication. We're going to build on that today with a conversation around really engaging in healthy conflict and how navigating conflict is really critical if you're going to lead in any sort of healthy, effective way that moves people and organizations forward.
Yeah, and let's not forget, we've got, as we work through this season, we've got our downloadable guides that go along with this series there at our website at magicintheroom.com. So there's a free guide there. It's available to everyone on that site. It'll kind of help you apply this concept as we talk through it today. But I'm excited to really kind of dig into how our leadership effectiveness relies on our ability to navigate conflict. So as we jump out, Hannah, I'm going to kind of toss this to you and let's jump out. Just let's get our arms around what is conflict.
Yeah, I think it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? Some people, they hear the word conflict and their reaction is like, no, don't want any of that. You know, we have people who try to avoid conflict at all cost. We have people who tend to engage in conflict. And conflict, I mean, it's really about two different perspectives, two different sets of expectations that don't align. And it could be a difference of opinions, of ideas, or personalities that clash. And I think that, you know, what we think about conflict, we think about two different types of conflict, right? There's task conflict, when you have some kind of disagreement about a topic or a way of doing something, or maybe the path forward. Any of those things could be part of a task conflict. And then there's personal conflict. That's the tricky one, right? When navigating relationships becomes part of the conflict.
Yeah, and I think about conflict almost as like the water that we swim in. Sometimes, like, it is a component of the environment we find ourselves in, and we cannot avoid it. I mean, even if some of us really try and avoid it, I know oftentimes that's me, and like, oh gosh, how do I avoid the pain associated with conflict? But like, that's an illusion. There is no avoidance of conflict. And even if I somehow manage to avoid some sort of interpersonal or business-centric conflict, then what that leaves me with instead is some sort of internal conflict that I'm managing. So it's not about if we engage in conflict. It really, to me, is around like, how do we engage in conflict? How do we move from reactivity in conflict and really letting our instincts drive us, some of which could be helpful, some of which probably aren't helpful, but move from that to just an intentional response, an intentional navigation of how am I going to take conflict and use it for my purposes and my vision, or for the good of this team? How do we become a healthier, more effective team because any specific conflict arises?
Yeah, and I'm going to, I don't know, maybe take it up a level and just say, if we're going to be leaders that are courageously hopeful, we're going to encounter conflict because we're going to have that vision for better tomorrow. We're going to see a path to achieve that, and we're going to exact our agency or call upon our agency to travel that path. And as we do that, we're going to encounter other people that we need to execute alongside us to activate that vision. Yeah. And they're going to have different personal values. They're going to have different task priorities. They're going to see a different path to arrive at the same place. So there's also this idea of embracing equifinality, the $1 million word for there's many places to arrive at this at the same outcome, or many ways to arrive at the same outcome.
Equifinality.
Equifinality.
That's the new one.
I didn't know it. I thought that would be when a horse dies.
Yeah, that too. No, that's. I think if you're a leader that's trying to move a team or an organization or yourself forward, you should encounter conflict. If we are leaders that have that vision and have that path and are calling upon our agency to move forward, but then every time we encounter what should be conflict, we pull back or take on the other person's values or take on the other person's path, it makes it very difficult to author our own story. Yeah. And I think that's what happens when, well, we don't want to have this difficult situation, or we don't want to be emotionally or psychologically, we don't want to feel unsafe or uncomfortable. So we allow another person to influence our condition, right? So we allow a situation to influence our path or how our approach. But anyway, as you guys were talking through that about what is conflict, like, well, here's how it plays out, and here's what it can mean to our ability to make something happen.
Yeah. I think for me, it's helpful to just think about conflict as not good or bad, not put a value judgment on it, just recognizing that conflict happens anytime there's a misalignment of two different sets of expectations, beliefs, values, opinions, approaches. Conflict is, and if we load it with a lot of emotional intensity, it can feel really unsafe or scary. And there's things that physiological reactions that we have, right? Our brain can go into what we call an amygdala hijack when the emotional intensity of that situation is triggering and our brain gets flooded and we are no longer thinking clearly and our emotional brain takes over. We're feeling strongly. And so I think having some awareness of that, and I think people respond differently to conflict based also on their previous experiences, right? If you've always experienced conflict as a negatively charged emotion that damages relationships, you're probably going to be a little prone to shy away from conflict.
Right. Well, and then we talk about that hijack, right? So in the space of conflict, I'm wanting to find myself in a circumstance where I respond emotionally and effectively give away my agency, right? Like I can't travel my path when I respond emotionally, when I'm hijacked, because whatever emotion we bring to a conflict conversation or a conflict scenario, that's what will be returned. So if I show up with standoffedness and, I'm already heated, like I don't have a shot. But I want to kind of jump into this area that, and I don't understand this all that well, but you mentioned like this idea between task conflict and personal conflict. But help me understand, because it would strike me that most of the time, if we are professionals in our professional setting, we're more likely to run into task conflict that can turn emotional. But Luke, can you help me understand, like when you say task conflict, what is that?
Sure. So when you break conflict up into those two buckets, task conflict is really around priorities, tactics, approaches, and it's a competition of ideas for what should we do and how should we get it done. And this is where like the research gets really interesting, because what they find is that teams that have high levels relatively of task conflict, so teams that have debate and sometimes heated debate, right? There are cultures that people accept, like, hey, we're going to get up, we're going to, raise our voices a little bit, we're going to like spice up our language, right? When they have conflict around what should we do, what's our priority, how should we approach this, what's going to be the most successful way to do it, the performance of the organization of that team increases. Now, if it turns toxic, right? If you get above a certain level of conflict where people are, throwing things and storming out, right? Not helpful, right? But if you keep it revved up, right? Keep the RPM on that task conflict high, the outcomes financially, productivity wise, are really good.
Now, there is a variable in there, though, that makes the difference whether the outcomes are better or worse, and that's trust. There's a reason we started this whole season talking about trust, because that's the foundation. So when there's high task conflict and high trust on a team, and I think the trust factor makes it so that, yeah, we can choose to disagree. There's psychological safety. We know, and we experience this within our team, right? We often have task conflict, and we can often have strong opinions and debate, and we have a high level of trust, and we have a high level of psychological safety. I trust that our relationship is not going to be damaged because I disagree. And I feel safe to raise my voice in dissent if I don't agree with the approach, like what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. We feel free to have those conversations and work it out. And often we come to a third way, right? That's even better than maybe the original options. I think that sometimes, we see two different ways, but when we can come together in a creative, high trust, task conflict, we can find that third way that's even better.
But I think you really touched on something important there, which is come together to address task conflict. And it's that creation of space to contemplate what's at hand. Like, what is the matter at hand? How do we contemplate this thing together? Basically sharing my perspective. So through working through this conflict, you also get to know me a little bit better, like my perspective on it, what values of mine is actually fueling my approach to this. And then you're making a conscious decision to yield or accelerate. Either you're trying to move me and persuade me, or you might decide to give me the win. Right? And all those strategies and dynamics continue to play out, ultimately in the name of team health. And I think knowing, like, when do you have to have the win? When is there no equifinality? When is there no other way to get there other than my way? Versus when can I see your way and say, okay, like, let's try that.
Yeah. Well, I think that self-awareness is key to everything, right? I mean, there's a reason we did a whole season on leading yourself, right? You do have to understand what are my non-negotiables and what am I willing to bend on. And if I have that, right? If I know that about myself and I've led myself effectively enough to know what my non-negotiables are, I do get to engage in conflict with curiosity and with inquiry rather than it has to be my way every single time. And I think that tactic of being inquisitive when there's conflict is really powerful for people listening. So when we're in a meeting, when we disagree, being able to take it a step deeper and say, okay, Hannah, you seem really passionate about your thought here. Like, what's driving that? I'm really curious. Why is it that you feel so strongly about it? Like, that question unlocks more insight so that we can make a better decision tactically, but also does build psychological safety and trust on the team. And so I think, that's one takeaway from this conversation, is that just being curious about where are we different here? Like underlying our value and assumption, worldview. Let's get that on the table, and then we can have more conflict, right?
Well,
in a healthy way.
And that level of curiosity is also key to self-management during conflict, right? When we notice that we're getting heated, we're getting triggered, we are maybe starting to feel emotionally engaged, right? And we notice that our reaction is sometimes might seem disproportionate to what's actually happening, right? Having that curiosity to self-coach and ask yourself those questions is really powerful. So there's two strategies that we can use to manage our emotional states. And one of them is labeling the emotion, like actually pinpointing what exactly am I feeling. And that invites curiosity. So what happens when I try to name the emotion that I'm feeling, the activity in my brain switches from the amygdala and the limbic system that's responsible for the emotional intensity and reactivity. It switches to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for rational thought. And the brain can only do one thing effectively at a time, either with thinking clearly or with feeling strongly. So when my brain is searching for a label, it switches activity into the thinking part of the brain. And then when we ask ourselves the question, why am I getting so emotional about this? Or where is this emotion coming from? Why is this so important to me? Again, we're switching our activity into the thinking part of the brain, and we're lowering the intensity of the emotion and allowing for space to actually think. And that in and of itself helps to manage our own reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a little bit of testimony. I was talking to Brian Gooden last night, and I was just like, Brian, like, just between me and you, like, I'm really pissed off right now. And like, I'm going to tell you all the reasons why. And because I was speaking about the emotion.
Yeah.
I wasn't coming from the place of emotion. So then it's like, here's the laundry list of things that I'm really concerned about and that are upsetting me about the industry we're in. Right? And here's all the things that we can see that aren't being addressed that are creating risk. But if I come at that with emotion, I'm not going to be able to communicate or persuade or say the things that need to be said. But just by transitioning from that limbic system to the prefrontal cortex with that intervention, and I think that is a tactic that's worth naming, is like, even if we find ourselves in a meeting, so a tactic that I like to use is like, I'm naturally an introvert. So if I'm in a group, or especially a large group that I'm not familiar with, it's the first time I'm around, it's the first time we're tackling this subject matter, maybe I'm not familiar, so I'm unsafe. I'll say, I'm going to have to ask for your grace because I'm naturally an introvert, and it's really uncomfortable for me to stand in front of 200 people that I don't know and talk about something when I'm not necessarily the expert in this room. So give me a few minutes and eventually I'll settle in and we'll have a great session today. But just by naming that, it helps me kind of regulate through that. Again, get out of that limbic system where I'm like, I'm anxious, I'm starting to panic, I don't know the thing that I should kick off with, or is this really going to land right? And all that worry and emotion, if I can just switch it to say, here's what I'm feeling, everyone. One, they give me the grace, but two, it naturally settles me down.
Yeah. And I think that's another key, right? Because emotion is information. It's not helpful to pretend that we don't have the emotion or to suppress it or just push it away. It is helpful to pay attention to it, right? We talk about intentional leadership as noticing and then choosing and acting. I'm noticing that I'm having emotion around this. I'm curious about what's driving it or how I can shift my attention from an inward focus to an outward focus on the outcome, engage the thinking mind. That way we reduce the reactivity. I think it's the reactivity that can be unhelpful and that can lead to some of the personal conflict that can get inflammatory.
Yeah. Well, and I think as leaders, we have to jump on the interpersonal conflict or the relationship conflict and set boundaries around that really quickly. Like we can't let a snide remark or a passive aggressive remark, like we can't let that stand in the meeting, in the room, in the conversation. So that's our role as leaders, to keep it tactical and not let any question of people's character enter in. Now, if there is a true, authentic character question, right, we're going to have upcoming episodes about performance management, right? So we'll get there, right? There are times that conflict is like my way or the highway, you're out of here. But in a lot of cases, it's just training people and showing people and modeling. We don't go personal. That's not helpful. So I'll give you an example. I was on a call a few weeks ago and someone made a passive aggressive comment and they were like, well, I thought that we had said but it sounds like you guys want to do something different. So whatever, I guess I wasted my time on this. And I was like, pause. Could you please explain what you're frustrated about? And like, do you feel like this team did something wrong or wronged you in some way? And it was, it was fine. They backpedaled pretty quickly, like, well, no, but that was setting a norm. That was setting a boundary to say, we're not passive aggressive here. We're straightforward. And this isn't a place where we get to lob out an emotional bomb and then walk away, right? We don't throw grenades here. And so we got to be quick to that. Like that's a tactic here. Quick to set those boundaries to keep it from getting relational.
Yeah. And to contrast what you shared earlier about high performing teams, when you have high trust and high task conflict, those teams perform better over time. Mm-hmm. Well, the research also shows that teams with high personal conflict perform worse over time. Right. And so, when it gets personal, and sometimes conflict can feel personal. And so that's another choice that we as individuals can make in leading ourselves, mm-hmm. and how we can help facilitate for our team is to separate the task conflict from the personal. If I feel really strongly about something like a way forward, or I put a lot of effort into a project and somebody doesn't like it, that can feel really personal, right? Mm-hmm. We put some of ourselves in it, but being able to separate that and choosing to not make it personal, and then choosing to, I think anytime when people get triggered emotionally and start reacting, that's where temptation to, where we see things go sideways is when it gets into just personal attacks or character assassinations, or just people deciding that if somebody doesn't agree with me, I really don't like them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, we're not going to the likelihood of me changing someone else's values to align with mine is very small.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a huge lift, and it's a lot of investment and very relational dependent. But as I really think about this process, it's, for the most part, we can identify personal or relational conflict in professional settings as generally unhelpful. Mm-hmm. Task conflict in professional settings is generally helpful. Mm-hmm. So in order to have the conflict that we need, which is task conflict, we need to avoid relational conflict. Mm-hmm. Therefore, right, leading ourselves, emotional self-awareness, the ability to intervene on ourselves, and the requisite delay in satisfying our own emotional need.
Yeah.
The little thing that says, lash out. The little thing that says, you were wronged, you were offended, get even right now. Like, those are the things we have to set to the side in order to move things forward. And this is why I think the saying exists. You can be right or you can be effective.
Yeah. Yeah. That temptation to do the let the record show that I actually did send that email and you didn't read it, right? Those things, right? Let's correct the record. Let's put that out there, right? Is so tempting. I mean, for me, and I think for all of us, everyone wants fairness, but like I have very high justice orientation. I mean, that's what's driving me, like calling the government, to try and right some wrong with this behemoth. This is an inside, comment here. I'm like on the phone on hold for these hours trying to right some sort of wrong that the behemoth like doesn't even notice, right? So for me, with that justice orientation, like I hear someone make a comment that's inaccurate, and like I'm just like, no, everyone here needs to know that that's not the truth with a capital T. The truth is this person did their job and that person that's talking didn't. So, and I better make sure I say that. But exactly what you said. I can be right or I can let it go and we can be effective and get done what we need to get done. So there is a time to be right and to let the record reflect what is actually true. If it's intentional, right? If you're not just being guided by your instinct for justice, your instinct to be right, your instinct to get the last word, your instinct to save face or protect your ego, right? Don't let that pull you out of your flow of effectiveness, of your super objective. And again, like it all goes back to leading yourself, right? Do you understand what your super objective is for this conversation, this meeting, this project? And if you understand that, why would you let an inaccurate comment or someone else's immaturity keep you from accomplishing that objective?
And that's a great tactic right there, right? Focusing, anchoring back to purpose or the super objective, the overarching objective for the task, the project, the team, the organization, whatever it is that we're here to accomplish.
Yeah.
And that external focus and that focus on the why, the purpose, the super objective helps us from, getting pulled into some of those reactions.
Yeah, super effective tactic. Hey, we're all here to fulfill mission X, right? Did we all say that that's what we wanted to do? I'll just use our purpose of Purpose and Performance Group. We're all here to build thriving communities, right? That's what we all signed up for. We want to be a part of building thriving communities with our client organizations. Yes, I see everyone nodding. Okay, this is a good conversation, but like what's the right next step out of this conversation to help us fulfill our purpose as effectively as possible? And that refocusing, that tactic right there, like it moves people out of reactiveness into intentionality, and it puts, makes the things that aren't important, right? It shows that they're not important and reprioritizes what is it that we're actually here to do.
And then along with, to, I think, help avoid things getting personal too, is just assume positive intent. Most people have positive intent. Sometimes our intention doesn't show up in the way that we expected it, or it doesn't land the way we intended for it. And we do tend to judge ourselves by our intention, and we judge other people by their behavior. And that gap between intention and behavior, that's our blind spots, right?
Yeah.
But if we can extend some grace, if we want others to try to see our intention, maybe we can choose to assume that whatever this person is doing, their intent is positive. Even that can help avoid a lot of personal conflict.
Yeah.
And just kind of embracing this idea that, when we do find ourselves post relational conflict, the same things that restore trust are the same things that build trust.
Yeah.
That ability to just share our logic, our positions, creating that space to contemplate, know the other person knowing that, I'm in it for them, or we're in this together, and bringing those things back home, I think is kind of creates that path to restoration. But Luke, I'm really interested in, let's talk about the really moving things forward. And if we want to accelerate growth, we want to accelerate sustainability and vibrance in our brands, as a leader, what can I do to really embrace and activate task conflict inside the team?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give us a new word to use in this conflict conversation, which is resistance. So for me, you used the word agency earlier. If I'm thinking about me as a leader, when I'm practicing and building my agency, right, my ability to move a team forward towards my goals or the shared goals of the team, there will be change. Change is a constant. Change is always involved, but there's always resistance to change. And so I think about conflict as resistance when it is a response to change or learning new things or being uncomfortable. And I like using the word resistance because it takes some of the negative connotation out of it. And I just think, am I experiencing the appropriate and healthy level of resistance right now? And if the level of resistance is 0, then the answer to that question is no. That is, 0 is not an appropriate amount of resistance to be experiencing if you're interested in moving things forward. So for me, if I truly am about my personal purpose, I am going to be creating resistance in teams that I'm a part of. And I just think that's the truth, right? I'm not going to apologize for it. Even with clients, right? We're hired to make change happen. And if I go a month or a couple weeks and I haven't sparked resistance in some way, that's a red flag to me that I'm not being effective. It doesn't mean that resistance should be toxic or blow people up or make things unhealthy or whatever. It just means that there is a level of resistance that is healthy in growing organizations and in growing people.
That just sparked a whole other way of thinking of conflict for me, just replacing the word conflict with resistance. So we know what happens. Resistance is necessary for anything to grow and to get stronger. When we're at the gym and we're lifting weights, we're using resistance that will actually create little tears, right? And it's in the recovery that we get stronger. Mm-hmm. But both the resistance and the recovery are necessary for strength, for resilience to grow. So if we apply that concept to team task conflict, that kind of resistance and repair, restoration, recovery, that is what makes a team grow stronger and better and perform at a higher level. And something you said earlier, Chris, you mentioned the word restore, right? So if there is relational conflict, those are like little tears in fabric. And So we talked about when we don't feel safe, the opposite of feeling safe is feeling under threat. So when the brain feels like it's under threat, when something feels personal or our values are being challenged, right, it can send the brain into a fight or flight response, right? We've talked about survival strategies earlier in previous episodes. But that's really when the brain is under threat, right? We respond either in fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Those are mechanisms that we've developed to protect ourselves. And that's what drives the reactivity, right? And our reactions, often our first reaction is not always the most helpful, right, to a relationship. And when we have a reaction, it creates a little tear in the fabric of that relationship. And the sooner or more intentional that we go about repairing that tear, that actually makes the fabric stronger. That affects how that relationship continues to develop, right? So if you constantly have tears with no repair, fabric's going to fall apart. Relationship's going to fall apart. If you are intentional about repairing soon and intentionally, that relationship can actually go stronger, right? So our initial reaction doesn't necessarily say who we are, but how we choose to respond and restore that relationship and repair informs who we're becoming.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge reflection of character there. And I think what you highlight there is the types of teams that can sustain and the types of relationships that can sustain when they have that dynamic thing, when we can move in and out of conflict and become stronger as a result because we have the ability to restore. Yeah. The people on the team have the requisite character, which we'll talk about performance development later, right? And performance management. But like, there should be boundaries. If there are people on our teams that don't have the capacity to restore the relationships post-conflict, then we have to take a serious evaluation of that, an assessment of if that person is helpful to that team dynamic and to our ability to get things done. And if they're not able to contribute on our team, then we're holding them back from a team that really needs them.
At least that's what we say.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, so, the other metaphor I'd use around this resistance thing is just like, do we need to push the pedal down a little bit harder, right? Is this organization at peak performance, or does it need a little bit more, cattle prodding to move it forward a little bit? Maybe that's a bad metaphor, but I do think as leaders, we got to be a bit of a cattle prod sometimes and zap the cow in the ass and get it moving to be able to keep moving forward.
I mean, the whole thing is, it's like, I think part of a leader's role is applying appropriate pressure.
Yeah.
The same way, like, if I'm not feeling resistance, there are serious issues.
Yeah.
Right? Either we're not moving things forward, we're not moving at the speed of the problem, or, I mean, what we see most often in underperforming organizations is you have teams of yes people. Mm-hmm. And there is no resistance because everyone just says yes.
Right.
And so there is no conflict. It's one person's vision that's being executed in literally every department. And it's impossible for one leader to cast vision for every operational role in an enterprise. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or you see some elephant in the room that everyone has gotten so used to ignoring. I mean, there are teams that go years with this elephant just sitting there, making a mess, knocking over the furniture, eating all the peanuts, whatever, shitting all over their house, right? And they're just so used to ignoring it that they're not even conscious of it anymore.
Yeah.
And someone new comes in and they're just like, what are we going to do about this problem? Mm-hmm. Oh. And it's either what problem? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, guess what? We've lost money the last 5 quarters in a row, and we haven't done anything differently. are we going to do something differently? I don't know. That'd be really hard. Okay. Well, in that case, leader, you're going to have to make people, you're going to have to take them by the back of the head and push them over and stare the elephant in the face and be like, look, here's this thing. Right. Just yesterday, Hannah and I were in a meeting, and a couple members of an executive leadership team, and there's a project that they're all interested and passionate about moving it forward, but we're going on like 3-4 months and the thing's just like stalled out. And they're like, well, let's do another meeting and let's think about it. We'll do an internal. And
we've been really busy.
Yeah. And so we just had to sit there and say, look, here's what we see. We see there's 2 departments that arguably could own this project, but neither of them actually own it. So no one's doing anything.
And it's a hot potato. And
right. So the CEO, by default, every time there's a decision, it's got to go in their waiting list, in their hopper, and they're dealing with investors, and they're dealing with high net worth customers, and they're doing all of this stuff, and you expect them to move this project forward. Do you guys really think that's going to work? And they just kind of looked at each other, and a couple of them got like little grins on their faces, like, oh, yeah, you're right, And so conflict doesn't mean that people get mad and angry all the time. Mm-hmm. It's just being able to deal with uncomfortable situations, being willing to have the courage to step into it, out of love, I would say. Like that's probably what we should have spent the entire podcast on, right? How do we enter conflict out of love? How do we create resistance out of love and move communities forward?
Yeah.
Because we care about where we're going.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the people that we're going with.
Yeah. I think it's a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Any parting shots?
I think it's all about agency. Like, do you have agency in the conflicts in your life? Are they intentional? Or do they happen to you when you can't avoid them anymore? They catch up to you. The elephant finally knocks a hole in the roof and it rains, or are you saying, no, I'm going to actually stoke some of this. I have agency here. I have an opinion. And so I think that's like the litmus test. Do you have agency? Do you have an agenda? If you don't have an agenda as a leader, like that's your first job. Go figure out, what is your agenda for this team? What is your goal that is important enough to you that you're willing to go crack a couple eggs over this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, back to intentionality around how we engage with conflict. What do I notice about what types of conflict am I avoiding and why? What types of conflict am I quick to jump into and why? And just noticing, right, our own level of engagement with conflict and maybe choosing to engage in healthy, productive task conflict while managing our emotional reactions. And taking action on that, right? How can we move the needle forward? Where do I need to apply some pressure? How can I be intentional about that in a way that doesn't stir up all kinds of personal, emotional conflict, but that can be productive?
Yeah. I'll kind of wrap up by saying, when I think about the concept of kind of loving people from these spots of incompetence to competence, I think that's something that we're accountable to. There's going to be conflicts as we travel that path. Navigating the conflicts, we are as accountable to navigate that conflict as we are to love people from spaces of incompetence to competence. So you're really starting to see how these ideas come together to say, what are we accountable to? Moving people from here to there, addressing the conflicts along the way, setting up the guidelines or the boundaries of what's acceptable, what do we celebrate, and what can we not tolerate. And that will kind of continue to be our conversation as we move through the rest of the season. So thank you guys for the time today.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben West. Social media management by Emma Holland and Maggie King Robinson. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded on-site in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com. And you can always reach out to us. Either contact us through our website, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. And if you liked what you heard, leave us a review and share your thoughts.